I need to tell you what happened before the words stop making sense, before the green becomes all I see, before I forget what my name used to mean in Gothic instead of the guttural approximation they've given me. I was Tertius Valen, Manufactorum Overseer 3rd class on a forgeworks whose designation I've already forgotten, and I need to speak these words while I still can, because soon there won't be enough left of who I was to remember why this matters. They say the Emperor protects, but no one tells you what happens when the Emperor's enemies decide protection is the last thing you need, when they decide instead that you're going to help them, that your skills have value in their grotesque economy of violence, that your survival depends entirely on your continued usefulness to creatures who measure worth in explosions and killing efficiency, and whether something makes a satisfying noise when it breaks. It was the 3rd planet in the Groll system, one of those anonymous industrial worlds that exists only to feed the Imperium's endless appetite for munitions and lacels and the 10,000 components that keep the war machine grinding forward. I'd spent 22 years in Manufactorum K7, working my way from assembly deck to oversight position, and I thought I understood the shape of my life, the daily quotas, the monthly tithes, the decade liturgies where we gave thanks for the privilege of service. The facility produced armor plating primarily, thick ceramite sheets that would eventually be bolted onto Chimera transports or lemon russ hulls, anonymous components in the Emperor's grand design. We were 12,000 workers processing refined ore into military-grade protection, and if I thought about it at all, I imagined dying in some industrial accident or living long enough to receive the brass pin they gave you after 40 years of service. Those were the boundaries of possibility in my world. The factory was my universe, 7 kilometers of processing. Lines and stamping machinery and heat treatment furnaces, all of it wrapped in the familiar smell of hot metal and machine oil, and the ozone tang of plasma cutters, all of it punctuated by the rhythmic thunder of industrial presses that beat like a second heartbeat once you'd worked there long enough. The Orks came during second shift on a day that had been unremarkable until the moment it became the worst day of my life, though I wouldn't understand that for several weeks, wouldn't grasp that this was the day I stopped being human in any way that mattered. The alarms started as a distant wailing, the kind you heard during drills, and for perhaps 30 seconds we all continued working because the alternative was failing to meet quota. And quota was sacred. Quota was how you proved your worth to the Imperium. Then the east wall of processing Bay 7 simply ceased to exist, replaced by a hole large enough to fly a Valkyrie through, and they came pouring in like a green tide of muscle and scrap metal and roaring laughter that sounded like landslides learning to find joy. I'd seen picked captures during threat briefings, grainy images that made them look almost manageable, almost comprehensible as an enemy. The reality was different in ways that made my hindbrain scream. They were massive, each one easily 2.5 meters tall, broad as cargo haulers, their skin the color of spoiled vegetation, but somehow vital, somehow radiating aggressive health that made our pallid Manufactorum complexions look corpse-like by comparison. They wore armor that appeared to be assembled from scrap and salvage and pure aggressive will, plates bolted directly into flesh in some cases, painted in garish reds and yellows and blacks that hurt to look at after years of regulation gray and brown. They carried weapons that defied every principle of engineering I'd learned, guns too large for their frames, blades welded to firearms, ammunition belts feeding into mechanisms that looked like they should explode with every trigger pull. And the noise, Emperor preserve me, the noise they made. It wasn't just sound but a physical presence, a wall of bellowing and mechanical roaring, and what I slowly realized was laughter, constant laughter, as if violence was the galaxy's greatest joke and they were the only ones perceptive enough to understand the punchline. They tore through the facility like a storm, given flesh and malicious intent, and we ran because that's what you do when the alternative is being crushed or shot or grabbed, though I learned quickly that running was only the illusion of agency, that they were herding us like livestock, culling some and directing others with a purpose I couldn't yet comprehend. I made it almost to the west emergency exit, was perhaps 10 meters from what I thought was salvation, when something lifted me off my feet with a grip that encompassed my entire torso. I remember thinking very clearly that I was about to die, that this was how it ended, crushed in the hand of a Xenos monster while trying to flee my post, dying in dereliction of duty. But the expected crushing pressure never came. Instead, I found myself held at eye level with a creature whose face was all jutting jaw and tiny cruel eyes and tusks that emerged from its lower lip like biological weapons, and it stared at me with an expression I couldn't read, its head tilted slightly in what might have been curiosity. "Dis-1," it said in Gothic, so thickly accented I barely understood, the words emerging from that massive mouth like rocks being ground together. "Dis-1's got de marks, see? De boss marks." It was pointing at my oversight insignia, the small brass pin on my collar that designated my rank. Means E tells de Overgits what to do, useful dat, and just like that, my fate was decided by a monster's recognition that I wore a supervisor's badge, that I represented some crude parallel to their own hierarchical structures. The orc tucked me under one arm, like I was a data slate and kept moving, and I hung there upside down, watching my world disappear behind us through a curtain of blood rushing to my head and comprehension slowly dawning that I wasn't going to die immediately, which somehow felt worse. They took approximately 400 of us from that facility, though the number decreased during transport as some tried to escape or simply gave up, going limp in ways that made the orcs lose interest and discard them like broken tools. We were loaded into what I can only describe as a troop transport, designed by someone who understood the basic concept of vehicles but approached the implementation with aggressive contempt for efficiency or comfort or safety. It was a metal box with wheels, enormous wheels, each one taller than I was, powered by engines that roared and belched black smoke and sounded perpetually on the verge of catastrophic failure. There were no seats, just a cargo bed where they threw us like produce, and when the vehicle started moving it did so with sudden violence that sent us tumbling, and then it never stopped moving with that same violent unpredictability, every bump magnified, every turn taken at speeds that seemed designed to test whether inertia, or the metal walls, would win the battle for our structural integrity. The journey to their camp took 3 hours that felt like 3 days. We couldn't see where we were going, just caught glimpses through gaps in the metal plating, wasteland mostly, the bombed-out remains of what had been agricultural settlements, the burned shells of defense positions that had failed to hold, and everywhere, more orcs, always more of them, moving in packs and mobs that suggested numbers far greater than the initial assault force. This wasn't a raid, I realized slowly. This was an occupation, a conquest, and we had simply been present when they decided our facility had strategic value. The camp itself defied every military principle I'd been taught during civil defense training. There was no perimeter in the traditional sense, just a sprawling collection of structures that looked like they'd been assembled during a fever dream. Buildings made from crashed Imperial vehicles, tents stitched from tarpaulins and banners, and what I slowly recognized as flayed skin, though whether human or Xenos, I couldn't tell. Smoke rose from 100 fires, and the air tasted of burning promethium and cooking meat and something else, something organic and fungal that caught in the back of my throat. The noise was worse than the facility had been, Constant metallic hammering, engines revving, guttural shouting in their brutal language, occasional explosions that made everyone human flinch while the orcs just laughed or barely noticed. They separated us immediately, the orcs moving through our group with decisive brutality. Some they pointed toward one area, some toward another, and some they just killed immediately with casual backhand blows or shots from weapons held one-handed. I couldn't discern the pattern at first, couldn't understand what determined who went where, but then I realized they were sorting us by perceived utility. The young and strong toward labor details, the technically skilled toward their workshops, everyone else toward processing. I didn't want to contemplate. When they reached me, the same orc who'd grabbed me initially pointed at my insignia again and growled something in its language, and suddenly I was being dragged toward a structure that looked like it had been assembled from 3 different Imperial vehicles, welded into an architectural obscenity. Inside was heat and metal, and the overwhelming smell of oil and ozone and burned flesh, and I understood immediately that this was their equivalent of a manufactorum, their industrial center, except organized according to principles that made my orderly mind want to shut down entirely. There were workbenches, yes, but arranged in no logical pattern. There were tools, but scattered like they'd been dropped wherever last used and never organized. There were parts and components everywhere, Imperial, Orc, and things I couldn't identify, all mixed together in chaotic profusion. And there were humans, dozens of them, working at various stations with the frantic intensity of people who understood that stopping meant death. An orc even larger than the others, I would learn this one was called a mech, their equivalent of a tech priest, though the comparison was obscene, stomped over and grabbed my face, turning my head roughly to examine me from different angles. Its hands smelled of motor oil and something bitter, and its grip left bruises on my cheeks that would take weeks to fade. "A Nuva boss git, is it?" It rumbled, then seemed to make a decision. "Right. See dat mess?" It pointed toward a pile of Imperial equipment. Melter guns mostly, I realized, probably looted from a PDF armory. "The boys want dem workin'. Fix 'em. Make 'em shoot good. Do dat, you eat. Don't do dat." It made a gesture across its throat with one massive finger, the meaning universal and utterly clear. So I fixed them. What else could I do? I sorted through the pile of melter guns, most of them damaged in ways that ranged from simple power cell depletion to catastrophic thermal damage that had fused internal components. I had no proper tools, no diagnostic equipment, no replacement parts except what I could salvage from the most damaged units. But I had 22 years of manufacturing experience. I understood Imperial engineering, and more importantly, I understood that my continued survival depended entirely on producing results. I worked through the night, that first night, learning quickly that the Orks had no concept of shifts or rest periods, that they simply expected work to continue until it was done. Other humans brought me food at irregular intervals, rations that were clearly looted Imperial stock, supplemented with things I didn't examine too closely. I ate without tasting, without thinking. My entire focus narrowed to the task of making destroyed weapons functional again. By dawn, I had 7 melter guns operational. The Mackay tested them by firing at a chunk of concrete 20 meters away, and when the thermal beams reduced it to molten slag, it made a sound I'd learned to recognize as approval, a kind of pleased grunt that seemed to originate from deep in its chest. "Dis one's good," it announced to the other orcs. "Dis one knows the shooters, keep him." And just like that, my value was established, my utility confirmed, my continued existence justified by my ability to repair Imperial weapons so Orks could use them against my own people. The days blurred together after that, each one structured around work and survival, and the gradual erosion of everything I'd thought defined me as human as imperial, as a servant of the emperor. I learned their rhythms, their expectations, their crude hierarchy. The mech was in charge of anything technical or mechanical. Under it were lesser orcs who specialized in specific tasks, vehicle maintenance, weapon fabrication, armor assembly, and under them were the humans, the useful ones, each valued according to their skills and their ability to contribute to the endless, chaotic production that seemed to define orc existence. We didn't speak much to each other at first, we humans. It felt too much like admitting what we'd become, like acknowledging that we were collaborating with Xenos against the Imperium we'd been raised to serve. But eventually, exhaustion and fear and simple human need for connection broke down those barriers. There was Mera, who'd been a precision welder and now assembled armor plates according to Orc specifications that violated every principle of metallurgy. There was Dask, formerly a vehicle mechanic, now maintaining the crude but disturbingly effective war machines the Orcs called trucks and wagons. There was Lissa, youngest of us, who'd been an apprentice on a plasma generator, and now calibrated weapon sights with shaking hands and tears that dried in the heat of the workshop. We shared information in whispers during the brief moments when the Orcs weren't paying attention, where to find better tools in the chaos, which Orcs were more volatile and should be avoided, how to make our work appear more complex than it was, to buy time, to buy breath, to buy one more day of survival. The Orcs themselves remained largely incomprehensible to me despite daily exposure. They operated on principles that my Imperial-trained mind couldn't process. Their technology shouldn't work, but did. Their social structures were simultaneously anarchic and rigidly hierarchical. Their violence was both calculated and completely impulsive. They fought among themselves constantly, brutal scuffles that would have been lethal to humans, but that they treated like rough sport, and the hierarchy seemed to be in constant flux based on who could beat whom in combat. Yet somehow this chaos produced results. Vehicles rolled out of their workshops in increasing numbers, weapons proliferated, armor was hammered into shape and bolted onto eager warriors. And they grew. That was perhaps the most disturbing thing I learned during those early weeks. The Orcs literally grew larger the more they fought, the more successful they became. The ones who survived combat returned bigger, broader, more heavily muscled, as if violence itself fed them in some physiological way I couldn't understand. The mech was massive because it was successful at its role, respected by the others, and that respect somehow translated into physical size. There was something profoundly wrong about this, on a level that went beyond mere Xenos biology. It suggested the universe itself was rewarding their violence, that reality bent toward their brutal philosophy in ways that made humanity's faith and order and civilization feel fragile, feel arbitrary. I started having nightmares, though whether they were dreams or simply my mind trying to process what I was living through, I couldn't say. I dreamed of being crushed slowly, of my bones compressing while I remained conscious, of being absorbed into the green tide and forgetting my name, my past, everything except the imperative to work, to be useful, to survive one more day. I would wake shaking in the corner of the workshop where I'd learned to sleep, my hands already reaching for tools before I was fully conscious, because stopping felt dangerous even in sleep. The Orcs started calling me something. Not my name, they didn't care about that, but a designation in their language that roughly translated to fixer or mender. At first I hated hearing it, hated the way it reduced me to a function, but gradually I realized I was starting to respond to it more readily than to my actual name, that some part of me was accepting this new identity because the alternative was holding on to a self that no longer had any practical application. Tertius Valen had been a manufacturum overseer with a tiny apartment and a meal ration card and aspirations of eventually making second class. That person was dead, killed the moment the east wall exploded. The person who remained was Fixer, and Fixer's only concern was staying useful enough to keep breathing. I got better at my work, faster, more efficient, and I hated myself for it even as I recognized it was necessary. I learned to anticipate what the MEK wanted, learned to read the crude specifications they provided, and translate them into practical modifications. I became proficient at working with their scrap-based logistics, at making do with whatever materials were available, at adapting imperial engineering principles to accommodate Ork beliefs about how things should work. And here was the thing that truly broke something in my mind. Their beliefs mattered. The Orks had a collective psychic field. I'd heard rumors during threat briefings, a kind of Gestalt faith that actually altered reality. If they believed something would work strongly enough, it did work. Physics be damned. I started incorporating this into my repairs, adding elements that had no practical function but that looked dangerous or powerful or impressive, because I learned those modifications made the weapons work better in Ork hands, made them more reliable, more deadly. I was becoming complicit. More than that, I was becoming skilled at collaboration with the enemies of mankind. Every weapon I repaired would be used against Imperial forces. Every vehicle I helped maintain would carry Orks toward human settlements. Every piece of armor I worked on would protect a Xenos warrior from the Emperor's justice. I knew this, understood it with perfect clarity, and I did the work anyway because the alternative was immediate death. And some treacherous part of my hindbrain kept insisting that survival was imperative, that as long as I lived there was hope, even though I couldn't imagine what form that hope might take. 3 months in, I think it was 3 months, time had become slippery. The Mekke gave me a new assignment. They'd captured an Imperial Sentinel Walker, one of the bipedal scout vehicles, and it was badly damaged, but the MEK wanted it operational. This was significant work, complex work, the kind of project that would take weeks and require skills beyond simple repair. The MEK showed me the Walker, its armored cockpit cracked, one leg completely severed, its multi-laser mount torn away, and said simply, "Fix it, make it walk, make it shoot." Then it left me alone with the wreckage and a pile of scrap, and the understanding that this was a test, that my continued value hinged on whether I could accomplish something this ambitious. I threw myself into the project with an intensity that scared me. Part of it was survival instinct, but part of it was something worse. I was genuinely interested in the challenge, intellectually engaged by the problem of how to restore function, using inadequate materials and improvised tools. I scavenged components from a dozen sources. The missing leg I fabricated from parts of 2 different Ork vehicles, and it shouldn't have supported the Walker's weight, but I added elements that looked aggressive, that had teeth welded onto the ankle joint, and somehow when I tested it the leg held firm, locked solid like it had been manufactured in a forged temple. The multi-laser I couldn't replace, but I found an autocannon that the Orks had looted from somewhere, and I mounted it instead, modifying the targeting systems to accommodate the different weapon profile. It took me 5 weeks working every waking hour, and when I was done the Sentinel looked like an abomination, a hybrid of Imperial engineering and Ork aesthetic that hurt to look at if you had any appreciation for proper manufacture. But it worked. Emperor help me, it worked perfectly. The Mekke climbed into the cockpit, it barely fit, had to wedge itself into a space designed for human proportions, and piloted it around the camp, while other Orks hooted and bellowed their approval. When it returned, the Mech climbed out and did something I'd never seen an Ork do before. It patted me on the shoulder, a gesture that nearly dislocated my clavicle but that I understood was meant to express satisfaction, maybe even respect in whatever form that concept existed in their culture. "You's a proper mech boy now," it said, and I understood this was a promotion of sorts, an elevation in status. Other orcs started treating me slightly differently after that, not with kindness, they didn't have that capacity, but with a kind of rough acknowledgement that I occupied a position in their hierarchy, that I wasn't just a slave but something more like a specialist, a valued functionary. They gave me a marker, a crude badge welded from scrap metal that designated me as under the Meke's protection, and I wore it because not wearing it would have been suicidally stupid, and tried not to. Think about what it meant that I now bore Xenos insignia, that I'd traded my Imperial oversight pin for Orkish recognition. The nightmares changed after that. Instead of being crushed, I dreamed of transformation, of my skin taking on a greenish tint, of my hands growing larger and more brutal, of words in that guttural language becoming more natural than Gothic. I would wake and check my reflection in any polished metal surface I could find, searching for signs of physical change, terrified that collaboration would become assimilation, that usefulness would become absorption. The face that looked back was still human, gaunt, scarred, aged a decade in a few months, but still recognizably the face that had once belonged to Tertius Valen, manufactorum overseer, loyal servant of the Emperor. But my mind was changing, I could feel it happening, could feel neural pathways being rewired by repetition and necessity. I started thinking in Orkish terms sometimes, measuring value in Daka, their word for firepower, assessing situations by how killy they were, organizing workshop chaos according to principles that made no logical sense but that worked within their framework. The other humans noticed it too. I could see it in how they looked at me, in how they'd sometimes start to ask me something and then stop, uncertainty crossing their faces as they wondered if I was still one of them or if I'd crossed some invisible line. Lissa was the one who finally said it out loud. We were working late, just the two of us sorting through ammunition stores, and she stopped suddenly and looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "You've started talking like them," she said quietly. "Not the language, but the way you structure sentences, the words you emphasize. And you don't flinch anymore when they shoot something near you." I wanted to deny it, but I couldn't, because she was right. I had noticed myself becoming desensitized to the constant violence, had felt the startle reflex. Diminishing, had recognized that I was adapting in ways that went beyond mere survival skills. "We do what we have to," I said, and heard how the sentence came out in that same flat affect I'd learned from the Orks, stating fact without emotion or justification. "We survive, that's what matters." But even as I said it, I wondered if that was true, if survival at this cost was actually survival or just a slower form of death, a gradual erasure of everything that made us human, that made us imperial, that made us us. The war was going badly for the Imperium. I learned this from listening to the Orks, from watching the constant stream of looted equipment that flowed into camp. The initial invasion had been just the first wave. More Orks had come, and more, landing in crude spacecraft that carved trails of fire across the sky, disgorging hordes of warriors eager for violence. The PDF had collapsed. The local Imperial Guard regiments had been overwhelmed, and now the Orks controlled everything except a few fortified positions that they were slowly reducing through attrition and overwhelming firepower. We heard distant thunder sometimes, explosions from battles being fought over the horizon, and I tried not to think about the humans dying in those exchanges, tried not to think about how I was contributing to their deaths through my work. The Mick kept giving me more complex assignments. I repaired a looted Chimera transport, modifying it to accommodate Ork proportions and aesthetics. I calibrated the targeting systems on a captured Hydra anti-aircraft platform. I even worked on their crude aircraft, ramshackle flying machines that looked like they should fall apart mid-flight, but that somehow stayed airborne through sheer Orkish conviction and aggressive mechanical redundancy. Each project made me more valuable, more essential, more deeply embedded in their industrial apparatus. And the worst part, the thing that haunted me more than the violence or the noise or the gradual erosion of my humanity, was that I took pride in the work. When a system I'd repaired functioned flawlessly, when a modification I'd improvised exceeded expectations, I felt satisfaction, felt the same sense of accomplishment I'd once felt meeting manufacturing quotas. The work itself was still work, still engineering, still problem-solving, and my brain responded to successful problem-solving the way it always had, with a little dopamine reward, with a sense of competence and mastery. I hated myself for it, hated that I couldn't separate the intellectual satisfaction of good work from the moral horror of what that work enabled, but I couldn't stop the response any more than I could stop breathing. 6 months in, the Meg decided I needed an assistant. It brought me a young man, maybe 18, who'd been captured from a settlement raid. He was terrified, barely verbal, and the mech simply told me to train him, to make him useful, and left us alone. His name was Petrus, and for the first 3 days he barely spoke, just watched me work with wide eyes that kept darting toward the exits, as if he was calculating escape possibilities. I let him watch because there was nothing else to do, because explaining the situation would have required words I didn't want to say, truths I didn't want to articulate. On the 4th day he finally spoke. "How long have you been here?" His voice was hoarse, unused, and I realized I probably sounded the same way after my first days, before I'd learned that the Orks expected verbal responses, that silence read as insolence or stupidity. 7 months, I said, and watched him process that, watched him understand that survival for extended periods was possible, and watched hope and horror war across his face as he grasped what extended survival meant. "I'm going to teach you to work on weapons. Lass weapons mostly, they're simpler, good for learning basic principles. You'll watch me for a week, then you'll start doing supervised repairs. Then independent work once you're competent. We can't." He started, and I knew what he was going to say, knew the objection that was forming, the moral argument about collaboration and duty and loyalty to the Emperor. I cut him off. "We do what keeps us alive," I said, and heard the Orkish pragmatism in my own voice, the brutal reduction of all considerations to simple survival calculus. "Everything else is luxury we can't afford. You'll understand eventually, or you'll die. Those are the options." He stared at me like I was a stranger, like I was something that wore a human face but wasn't human underneath. And maybe he was right. Maybe that's exactly what I'd become, but I taught him anyway. Showed him how to diagnose power cell failures, how to clear blocked gas vents, how to recalibrate focusing crystals. He learned quickly, had good hands and better spatial reasoning, and within a month he was handling simple repairs independently, and I watched him go through the same stages I had. Initial resistance, then grudging compliance, then competence, then eventually that same treacherous pride in work done well. I watched him become useful, watched him learn to respond to the Orkish designation they gave him, watched him start to flinch less at violence and structure his sentences with that same pragmatic flatness. I'd become complicit in his corruption the same way I was complicit in the Orkish war effort, and I added that to the weight of everything else I carried, all the compromises and betrayals and moral erosions that accumulated like industrial slag, like the waste products of survival that couldn't be processed or purged, but just built up until they became foundational, until you were standing on a mountain of your own ethical failures and calling it solid ground. The mech liked to talk while it worked, I learned over time. Not conversation exactly, more like thinking out loud, but it seemed to expect responses or at least acknowledgement. It would discuss projects it was planning, modifications it wanted to try, other camps it had worked in before coming here. And gradually, through these one-sided dialogues, I assembled a picture of Orkish culture that was both more complex and more horrifying than I'd imagined. They weren't just mindless brutes. They had aesthetic preferences, technical philosophies, even something like humor, though their jokes usually involved someone or something being destroyed in creative ways. They had genuine curiosity about how things worked, though they approached investigation through dismantling and reassembly rather than theoretical study. And they had something that might have been respect for competence, for skill, for excellence in craft, even when that skill came from humans they otherwise viewed as barely worthy of notice. "You's got to touch," the mech told me once, watching me install a targeting array I'd salvaged and modified. "Most Yumi's day just follow day rules, do what day's told, but you understand the spirit of the thing, what makes it work in here." It tapped its head, and I understood it was talking about the Orkish Gestalt field, the psychic dimension that underlay their technology. "You's thinking like a mech now, that's good. Means you's a proper workshop git." I should have been horrified by this assessment, by the suggestion that I was starting to think like them, to internalize their principles, but instead I felt that same traitorous satisfaction, that acknowledgement of competence from the closest thing the Orks had to an authority figure in my domain. And that's when I knew for certain that something fundamental had broken in me, that I'd crossed whatever line separates collaboration for survival from genuine participation, that I wasn't working for the Orks under duress anymore, but was simply working, doing my job, fulfilling my function in a system I no longer questioned, because questioning served no purpose and changed nothing. The Imperial counteroffensive came. During the 10th month of my captivity, though I didn't know it was happening at first, just noticed increased activity in the camp, more Orks moving out toward the fighting, weapons being distributed at accelerated rates. The Mike was ecstatic, bellowing about proper battles and good fighting, and it demanded maximum output from the workshop, every weapon functional, every vehicle operational, everything we could produce thrown into the war effort. We worked around the clock, all of us, human and Ork both, and I found myself caught up in the urgency, in the drive to meet demand, to support the operation. And I didn't stop to think about what the operation was, what it meant, who was dying on the other end of the weapons I was repairing. Then they brought back captured prisoners, Imperial Guard by their uniforms, and everything stopped being abstract. They were kept in a crude pen near the workshop, and I could hear them sometimes, could hear them praying, calling out for help that would never come, screaming when the Orks decided to use them for entertainment or just for food. I recognized the regiment markings. They were from off-world, reinforcements sent to reclaim the planet, men who'd traveled across the stars to bring the Emperor's justice and had instead found only death or worse. One of them saw me through the workshop wall one day, made eye contact, and I watched recognition dawn. I was human. I was right there. Maybe I could help. He started to call out, started to beg, and I turned away, went back to my work, because what else could I do? I couldn't free them, couldn't even free myself, couldn't do anything except continue being useful and hope that usefulness would continue to be sufficient. But I heard him calling for hours after that, heard his voice getting hoarse, heard it finally stop, either because he gave up or because something had stopped him. And I kept working through it all, kept my hands moving and my mind focused on the task, because the alternative was acknowledging what I'd become, was facing the thing I saw reflected in that guardsman's eyes, not a fellow human, not a potential rescuer, but just another piece of Orkish infrastructure, another component in their machine, Petrus broke after that. I found him in the corner of the workshop 3 days later, wrists opened with a sharpened piece of scrap metal, bled out in the night when no one was watching. The Orks barely noticed, just had some lesser creatures drag the body away and told me to train another assistant if I needed one. But I didn't request another assistant. I couldn't face doing that again. Couldn't face watching another human being go through the same process of corruption and compromise. Couldn't bear being the agent of someone else's transformation into usefulness. The Imperial offensive failed. I learned this from the celebration that followed, from the increase in looted equipment, from the sheer triumphant violence that swept through the camp. The Orks had won, had broken the counter-offensive, had killed or captured or scattered the reinforcements that had come to save us. The planet was theirs now, truly theirs, and they would hold it until someone brought sufficient force to pry it from their grip. And given the Imperium's stretched resources and endless conflicts, that might be never, might be decades, might be long after everyone currently alive here had died or been consumed by the endless grinding machinery of Orkish conquest. I kept working. What else was there to do? I repaired weapons and vehicles and armor. I solved problems and improved systems and trained new human captives when the MEK brought them to me. I became a fixture in the workshop, as much a part of the infrastructure as the workbenches and the tool racks, present and functional and utterly reliable. The Orks stopped watching me closely, stopped worrying that I might sabotage something or try to escape, because they recognized what I'd become, recognized that I was domesticated, broken to harness, useful in the specific way that valuable slaves are useful, competent, efficient, and completely resigned to their circumstances. I'm still here now, still working, still being useful. It's been almost 2 years, though I've lost precise count, time measured now in projects completed and systems repaired rather than days or months. I rarely think in Gothic anymore, find myself structuring thoughts in that brutally simple Orkish way, reducing everything to function and utility and whether something works or doesn't work. My hands are different, scarred, calloused, spotted with chemical burns and healed cuts, moving with practiced efficiency through tasks I've performed 10,000 times. My face is different too. I've seen it reflected in polished metal, harder, older, with that same flat affect I once saw in the other long-term captives, the ones who'd stopped hoping for rescue and accepted survival as its own justification. Sometimes I remember being Tertius Valen, remember caring about quotas and efficiency reports and the small pride of wearing an oversight insignia. It feels like remembering someone else's life, someone naive, someone who thought he understood what service meant, what duty required. That person died in Manufacturum K-7 when the wall exploded and the green tide came pouring through. Died, and was replaced by this thing that works in an Orkish workshop, and responds to a guttural designation and takes pride in making enemy weapons function at peak efficiency. The MEK has started talking about moving to another war zone, another planet where the fighting is better, where there are proper enemies to fight and more advanced equipment to loot. It will take its workshop with it, it says, the vehicles, the tools, the useful specialists. It will take me, because I'm valuable, because I understand the work, because I've become one of those resources you don't abandon as long as it remains functional. I'll go because there's no alternative, because saying no isn't an option when you exist only as a function, as a tool with a voice. And here's the thing that keeps me awake during the brief hours when I'm allowed to rest. The thought that circles through my mind like a malfunctioning servo. I don't know if I want rescue anymore. If Imperial forces came tomorrow, if they somehow defeated the Orks and liberated this camp, what would happen to me? I'm a collaborator, a traitor, someone who's spent years working to support Xenos forces against humanity. At best, I'd face execution after interrogation. At worst, they'd hand me to the Inquisition, and I'd spend years being flayed and broken while they extracted every detail of what I'd learned, what I'd done, what I'd become. There's no path back to being Tertius Valen, manufactorum overseer, loyal servant of the Emperor. That door closed so long ago I can barely remember what it looked like when it was open. So I work, and I survive, and I try not to think about what I am now, what usefulness has cost, what happens when you're valuable to the wrong people for the wrong reasons. The Emperor protects, we used to say, but no one ever explains what protection means when the greatest danger isn't death but transformation, isn't ending but becoming something you can't recognize, isn't the wound but the scar tissue that fills it in and pretends to be wholeness while being nothing like what was there before. The Orks decided I was useful, and in that decision they destroyed me more completely than any weapon could have, killed everything I was and replaced it with this thing that functions and complies and survives day after day in a green nightmare that has become so normal I rarely remember to call it a nightmare anymore. I am useful, and therefore I continue, and usefulness has become indistinguishable from existence, and I cannot imagine what anything beyond usefulness would even mean. Cannot picture a life defined by anything except the next repair, the next project, the next demonstration that my continued survival remains justified by my productivity. They call me something in their language, now that I've learned, means the Humi who makes DA broken things work, and I respond to it more readily than I ever responded to my name, and somewhere in whatever remains of my mind that still thinks in Gothic, in imperial concepts, in human terms, I understand that this is the worst fate, not to be killed by the Emperor's enemies, but to be kept by them, to be maintained and utilized and valued, to have your survival guaranteed by your complicity, to learn that breathing and collaboration are the same thing, that every day you wake up is another day you chose usefulness over principle, function over faith, survival over the soul. I am useful to the Orks. I will remain useful until I stop being useful, and when that day comes I will be discarded as thoughtlessly as a broken tool, but until then I will work and comply and survive, because that's what happens when they decide you're useful, when they recognize that you have value, when they understand that humans can be resources like any other resource, to be exploited and maintained and deployed wherever they're most effective. This is my confession, my testimony, my explanation for why I am still breathing when so many others aren't. Not because I'm stronger or luckier or more faithful, but because I'm useful, because I made myself useful, because usefulness became everything when everything else was stripped away. The Emperor protects, but he doesn't protect from this, doesn't protect from the slow death of collaboration, from becoming a component in the enemy's machine, from learning that survival has a price that can't be paid in currency or blood, but only in the gradual dissolution of whatever made you human in the first place. I am Tertius Valen, and I work in an Orkish workshop, and I am useful, and usefulness has become all I am, and I think this will continue until there is nothing left of me but the usefulness itself, until the person is completely consumed by the function and there's no difference anymore between the tool and the hand that holds it. And the worst part, the thing I can barely admit even in this confession that no one will ever hear, is that I've become good at it, have developed genuine expertise in Orkish technical principles, have learned to think the way they think, to see problems the way they see them, to create solutions that work within their framework. I am good at being useful to Orks, and that skill will remain long after everything else has been burned away, will be the last thing standing when all else has collapsed, will be my epitaph and my damnation and the only proof I existed at all. Here worked a human who understood how to serve the enemies of mankind, who learned their ways and adopted their principles and made himself valuable to them, who survived by becoming exactly the thing he should have died rather than become. The green is all around me now, in the color of their skin and the paint they use, and the cast of the light filtering through tarpaulins stitched from their banners. Sometimes I think the green is getting inside me too, seeping in through my skin, through my eyes, through my breath, changing me in ways more fundamental than collaboration or corruption, making me into something that isn't quite human and isn't quite orc, but something in between, something that can interface with both worlds because it fully belongs to neither. Maybe that's what happens when they decide you're useful. You become a bridge, a translator, a hybrid thing that can process both languages and serve both functions, and in becoming that bridge you lose the solid ground of identity, become something fluid and adaptive and fundamentally uncertain. I don't know how this ends. Maybe it doesn't end. Maybe this is just existence now, an eternal present of work and survival and usefulness that continues until my body gives out, or the orcs find someone more skilled, or the Imperium finally brings enough force to burn this world clean. But however it ends, I know what the epitaph will say, know what judgment will be passed, know that there's no redemption available for someone who did what I did, chose what I chose, became what I became. I am useful to orcs, and that usefulness is my identity now, complete and defining and inescapable. This is what happens when they decide you're useful. This is the fate worse than death, worse than torture, worse than any suffering that has a defined end. You become a thing, a function, a resource to be deployed, and the cruelest part is that you have to maintain yourself, have to keep yourself functioning, have to protect the usefulness that justifies your existence, because without it there's nothing left, no reason to wake up, no justification for drawing another breath. You become complicit in your own exploitation, become the guardian of your own slavery, because the alternative is an ending you can't quite bring yourself to choose, while some animal part of your brain keeps insisting that survival matters, that breathing matters, that another day is better than no days, regardless of what those days contain. I am useful. I will remain useful. And somewhere beneath the usefulness, buried so deep I can barely find it anymore, something that used to be Tertius Valens screams silently and continuously, mourning not his death, but his transformation, not his ending, but his continuation, not the loss of life, but the loss of everything that made life worth living. The green tide came and it didn't kill me, and that mercy has become the worst curse imaginable, and I will carry it until there is nothing left to carry, until the last fragment of the person dissolves and only the function remains, pure and complete and eternally, damnably useful.